Ani buju jewel indigenous Nkojonong and Donjaba.
Today, I will be discussing the history of residential schools in Canada, focusing on lasting impacts and the ongoing process of healing and reconciliation with a focus on Indigenous perspectives. So, what are residential schools? Well, residential schools were government-funded and church-run institutions created with a purpose of assimilating Indigenous children into Euro-Canadian society. Children were forcibly removed from their families and communities and placed in these schools, often very, very far away from home. And the intent was not simply just to educate, but to fundamentally change who these children were. As Mussey explains in one of the articles that I read, residential schools were aimed at the erasure of the Indian child. This phrase highlights the deliberate attempt to eliminate Indigenous identity, language, and culture. This was not accidental, it was a calculated system of cultural genocide. The residential school system operated for over a century, beginning in the 1800s and continuing until the last school closed in 1996. Over 150,000 First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children were forced to attend these institutions across Canada. The scale and duration of these systems demonstrate how deeply embedded these policies were in Canadian society. The experiences within residential schools were often traumatic and harmful. Many children face physical, emotional, and psychological abuse. They were punished for speaking their language or practicing their cultural traditions, leading to a loss of identity and connection to their communities. Another article I read in the Guardian had a quote saying that residential schools were designed by the federal government as a part of a final solution to the Indian problem. This language essentially reflects the extreme and harmful intentions behind the system. The effects of residential schools did not end when the schools closed. One of the most significant impacts is intergenerational trauma. This term refers to the way trauma is passed down from one generation to the next. Even individuals who did not attend residential schools themselves have been affected. Another quote that Mussey highlights is the example of Richard Wagamese, who experienced the emotional effects of his parents' trauma from residential schools. This shows how deeply rooted and long-lasting these impacts are. In response to this history, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada was established to document the experiences of survivors and educate the public. As McCracken explains in his article, the TRC was tasked with collecting and sharing the history of residential schools to foster reconciliation. In 2015, the TRC released its final report, which included 94 calls to action. These calls emphasized the importance of education, awareness, and systemic change. Two other articles I read were by White and Castledon, and they kind of both note that education was identified as crucial to the reconciliation process, highlighting the role that learning plays in addressing past injustices. Despite these efforts, many challenges remain. Indigenous communities continue to face systemic inequalities rooted in colonial policies. According to The Guardian, racial injustices persist in areas such as child welfare and housing. This shows that reconciliation is not just about acknowledging the past, it also requires addressing ongoing issues in the present. Commemoration is an important part of the healing process. Indigenous-led memorials and projects help to honor survivors and create space for reflection. Cooper explains in his article that if Canada acknowledges the difficult history of residential schools, it must also pay tribute to the resilience of survivors and persistence of Indigenous nationhood. This shifts the focus from only trauma to also recognizing strength and survival. Indigenous approaches to healing often center on storytelling, land, and community. In Mussey's article, it discusses how storytelling can support healing, spiritual regeneration, and cultural resurgence. These approaches recognize that healing is not just individual but collective and deeply connected to the culture and identity. There are many examples of Indigenous-led healing initiatives, and the one example that really stood out to me is the art piece Walking with Our Sisters, which commemorates missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Cooper notes that projects like this signal the growing diversity in commemorative expression. These initiatives provide meaningful ways to communities to remember, heal, and reclaim their identities. Understanding why residential schools were created is key to understanding their impact. Two of the other articles I read, White and Castledon, explain that residential schools aim to serve cultural connections and assimilate Indigenous children into white Canadian society. This included replacing Indigenous traditions with European values, even through activities like sports. This shows how deeply assimilation was embedded into every aspect of the system. Moving forward, reconciliation requires more than just a symbolic gesture. It requires more meaningful action. One important step I think we can take as a community is by improving education and by integrating Indigenous perspectives into the classroom. As a teacher myself, I'm going into teachers' college. I know now the importance of having Indigenous speakers come in and talk to children about their history. I find that children will learn better when they have somebody come in who can tell them these stories and their firsthand experiences and, their intergenerational trauma that they have within themselves and what we can do as a community to improve ourselves. This includes kind of teaching the history of residential schools more honestly and respectively in classrooms, as well as incorporating Indigenous ways of learning. Another important step is supporting Indigenous-led initiatives. Communities must have the ability to lead their own healing processes and tell their own stories. Non-Indigenous individuals also have a responsibility to listen, learn, and take action. Moving forward, from the harms of the Canadian Indian residential school system requires a long-term commitment to truth, healing, and systemic change led by Indigenous communities. This includes continuing the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada by implementing its calls to action and ensuring all Canadians are educated about this history through schools and public awareness efforts like Orange Shirt Day. Healing must be supported through culturally appropriate mental health services, community-led programs, and the revitalization of Indigenous languages and traditions. At the same time, governments and institutions need to pursue justice and accountability by investigating unmarked graves, compensating survivors, and acknowledging responsibility. Supporting Indigenous self-determination, guided by frameworks such as the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, is essential, along with addressing ongoing inequalities in housing, healthcare, education, and economic opportunities. Reconciliation is an ongoing process that deepens on sustained action, respect for Indigenous rights, and meaningful collaboration to build a more just and equitable future. Overall, residential schools represent a painful and significant part of Canada's history. Their impacts continue to be felt today through intergenerational trauma and ongoing inequalities. Indigenous communities have shown resilience through storytelling, cultural revitalization, and community-led healing. Reconciliation is an ongoing process that requires education, reflection, and action. Miigwech.